I'm Ty Godwin, and this is the Butterfly Pavilion Podcast, finding light in darkness along my stage 4 cancer journey. This week, I'm thrilled to have Jonathan Howard, author of We Want Them Infected. We're going to try and get by without my daughter and co-host and talk about the litany of comic book villains that have infiltrated the United States Health and Human Services. I'm excited to have Dr. Howard, as he's the only one I know that can punk RFK Jr. as much as I do, but with far more intellect. We are pleased to have Jonathan Howard, a neurologist and psychologist from NYU's Langone and Bellevue Hospital, and author of We Want Them Infected. He is also known as The Flash, who is one of my long COVID superheroes. Over the last 3 or 4 years, I've come up with what I feel are long COVID heroes and also long COVID villains, and we'll also talk about long COVID villains. But before we jump into the meat of this, first off, did I pronounce? I'm not from New York. I spent a lot of time there. Did I pronounce Langone correct?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And being from the New York City area, as an icebreaker, are you a Jets, Giants, Bills fan, or none of the above?
Well, I became a Jets fan for a little bit because my son was very much into NFL football. And
Right.
So I bought some tickets for 2 seasons, and we sat through so many games where it was freezing cold and they were losing 50-0 that I said I would only take him to a Jets game if he misbehaved. But he was very good this year, so I took him to 0 games. No punishments for him. So.
Okay. No, I asked because our Broncos are in the playoffs, and I released our Broncos episode today. We normally talk about bringing light into darkness as I'm navigating both a long COVID and cancer journey, but advocacy has been a big part of my life for the last 4 years, and I've got to know Jonathan Howard over Twitter. So we were talking before we kicked this thing off. It's fun to finally meet someone in person. Be patient because we are going to get into some politics. It's kind of hard to avoid when you talk about today's topics, and that all revolves around health policy in the United States. It was interesting, interesting in the last week. The Dilbert cartoonist Scott Adams sadly died from a battle with prostate cancer metastasized to bone, which is what I've got. But he turned quickly to Canadian quack William Makis, who I'm sure you know, who recommends the ivermectin and
Bendazole.
Yes, thank you. So, bad advice does have its consequences. I mean, the current administration says, so, do what you want, but yet here's what's on the CDC website. Before we jump into some of the other questions, I did do some background on you. I watched your Eric Topol interview, so I kind of understood how a neurologist and psychiatrist winds up becoming involved in vaccines. But I was keenly interested in your experience on the front lines of the pandemic in New York City, which was hit first and hit hard. I just want to quickly read an excerpt from your book, and I'd like you to maybe chat about that experience that really, launched you into this, kind of tangent into COVID and vaccines and some of the lunacy that's been going on. But anyway, in your book, New York's horrific first wave volunteered in the ICU front line. I would occasionally gaze out a window to glimpse the crumbling ruins of the Renwick Smallpox Hospital on Roosevelt Island, reminding myself that humanity had defeated viruses before. That really stuck with me because I've been to Roosevelt Island. I actually ran a 5K there once, but I was always intrigued by that closed down kind of eerie hospital. But maybe you could chat a bit about that, those first days on the front lines, and also, that migration from neurologists to being involved in, COVID and vaccines and long COVID and all that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think actually I kind of have 2 qualifications for this space, one of which you mentioned and we'll talk about is my work at Bellevue Hospital since 2003. But really the first is I did become interested in vaccines and the anti-vaccine movement starting in 2010 when a
Okay.
doctor here who I trained with, who's not super famous these days, a woman by the name of Kelly Brogan, morphed into one of the country's most outspoken anti-vaccine doctors. And we were friendly. And I began to sort of wonder, how could my old friend and colleague start to embrace these very bizarre beliefs, even germ theory denial? She doesn't believe that HIV causes AIDS, for example. So in 2018, I knew enough about this, and I had made enough contacts to co-write a book chapter with law professor Dorit Reese, who is probably the country's leading legal expert in vaccines. So when the pandemic started, I knew every sort of anti-vaccine myth and technique and tactic and some of the big names and kind of how to refute them. So I entered the pandemic with some basic knowledge, but yeah, I mean, my COVID experience, a few things about it. I mean, it wasn't totally unique. I think by the time, but by this point in history, anyone who worked in a hospital has seen close to what I saw. I mean, you were right that New York City got hit very hard and very early.
Although I'd argue that people forget that sometimes. So even today, people chat in as if it were a cold, and I often remind them of the refrigerated morgues sitting outside hospitals. But
Well,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right, and that's not an accident. There's a deliberate COVID amnesia project, which actually I talk about in the sequel to We Want Them Infected, called "Everyone Else Is Lying to You," about this the movement to rewrite the history of the pandemic, and a lot of that involves the deliberate forgetting of what happened when COVID was allowed to spread uncontrolled in February and March of 2020, almost 6 years ago at this point. But I always describe my COVID experience by saying that I didn't do a lot, but I saw a lot. I'm not really sure that anyone necessarily was alive because of what I did. But I saw a lot of things, and I saw a lot of things that people who didn't work on a COVID unit didn't experience. For example, when we hear doctors say that COVID was harmless for people under age 60 or 70, and these are the doctors who are going to talk about now who are in charge of things, no one who worked on a COVID unit would say that. When doctors acted as if COVID killed you or you had permanent immunity, those were the only sort of two options. No one who worked on a COVID unit would say that, because we all saw people who were injured by the virus but not killed by it. So I think that my experience, and also we saw that COVID was hard to stop, that it found people who weren't taking any precautions. I mean, a lot of doctors and nurses got sick.
Right. Well, I think part of that, and probably what you talk in your sequel book, is people forget even how it's transmitted. So that translates into mask hating, and I talk about that in my previous podcast with Akiko Awasaki, and I believe it's a personal choice to mask, but I despise people that are mask haters, especially if they're trying to protect themselves. I happen to be immune compromised. There's settings where I use a mask, but anyway, sorry, you hit a nerve there with the delusion of some of the guidance. I want to jump into some of the current news as we migrate into some of the crazy characters. But over the last few weeks, we've seen measles outbreaks. I saw a kid die of rabies, of all things, because parents would refuse to give him a rabies vaccine after he got exposed. But the big news was the new guidance on vaccines. So Trump's administration overhauled the childhood vaccines with no input from ACIP and no new data, basically based on the retrospective review of two political appointees. I'm sure you've got opinions. Can you speak to what the vaccine schedule was, and what some of the guidance you're seeing come out of HHS?
Yeah, so you're talking about the decimation of the vaccine schedule. And this is exactly what I tried to warn about in We Want Them Infected. The subtitle to the book was How the Failed Quest for Herd Immunity Led Doctors to Embrace the Anti Vaccine Movement and Blinded Americans to the Threat of COVID. Now, I never predicted that things would get this bad, even though I was called hysterical, fear mongering. I
Right.
vastly underestimated the threat. I never envisioned that Kennedy would be put in charge and that top doctors from Harvard, Stanford, UCSF, and Johns Hopkins would help him along the way. But all of the doctors who I wrote about in We Want Them Infected were behind this policy change. So the main memo was written by Tracy Beth Hogue, who was at the FDA, and
Sure.
Martin Kuhldorf, who was at the CDC. And the document sort of supporting this as well was signed by Dr. Marty Makary at the FDA, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya at the NIH, and of course, Dr. Oz. And so what they did is they cut out, I think, 6 vaccines or 7 from the vaccine schedule. Rotavirus, RSV, hepatitis A, hepatitis B, influenza, meningococcal disease, and COVID. And they gave kind of 2 rationales for doing this, neither of which make any sense. The main one is they treated the vaccine schedule like it was a popularity contest. They said that Denmark, as if you can translate this small Scandinavian country of 6 million people to the 340 million people that we have here in the United States. Anyways, they tried to base the vaccine schedule based on Denmark,
Or or
probably.
or the Amish community.
Yeah. Well, that's a little bit of a myth because the Amish vaccinate, but for the most part. But anyway, so and this was not a new technique for the anti-vaccine movement. Previously, anti-vaxxers would say, well, what about Japan? Because Japan, for I think about 13 years, didn't vaccinate its population against HPV. And now they're decades behind the rest of the world in eliminating cervical and other HPV related cancers. So that's one explanation that they gave. And the second explanation that they gave, which is even more horrible and disingenuous, and I'm going to be writing about this tomorrow for Science Based Medicine. So by the time this podcast airs, anyone can go read my article on Science Based Medicine about this, is they claim that they are trying to save vaccines. They are trying, they're claiming that vaccines are in competition with each other, and that if we just try to focus on the measles and polio vaccine, we'll get more uptake of those core essential vaccines. And that's all that they want to do is just protect and save vaccines by letting unvaccinated children get flu, COVID, RSV, meningococcal disease, RSV, hepatitis A and B. So it's completely disingenuous stuff from truly bad faith disinformation doctors, and we should absolutely, call them out that way as we do.
Yeah, as you were throwing out some of those names, I had a series of long COVID heroes and long COVID villains, and my villain, I had two sets. I didn't have Martin Kulldorff, but I had pretty much everybody else that I identified as kind of anti long COVID, because they also believe that if COVID is a hoax, you certainly don't believe you certainly don't believe long COVID. And long COVID, I've talked about at length in a number of episodes, but it's it attacks every system of your body, and in my case, led to disability. With a broken immune system, I now have stage 4 cancer. I'm not saying a vaccine prevents all of that, and I'm also saying if you get COVID, you'll get stage 4 cancer. But my oncologist very specifically said that my broken immune system either caused or exacerbated my stage 4 cancer. I get a lot of the trolls that attack me on that front, which is crazy to attack someone with stage 4 cancer. But I digress. A lot of what you talk about in your book ties to the Great Barrington Declaration, and I want you to talk about that. But reading your book, and of course it's a long book, I'm looking for the Cliff Notes version. It's hard for people with cognitive issues to go through a medical book of 750 pages, but I did read a fair amount of it, and I've been following, the Great Barrington Declaration. It reminds me a bit of, Project 2025. It's much smaller in its scope, and I think it was a conference and a 2-page paper. But it's rooted in a lot of the characters you mentioned, and also politics, which we'll get into. But maybe you can chat a bit about that Great Barrington Declaration, how it started and how it's now influenced our administration.
Yeah, so the Great Barrington Declaration was I've heard it best described as a 1-page online petition, which was written in October 2020 by 3 epidemiologists and our one health economist and 2 epidemiologists. We've already mentioned Martin Kulldorff and Jay Bhattacharya, and the third is Sunitra Gupta from Oxford. It was sponsored by a man by the name of Jeffrey Tucker, who sounds like a cartoon supervillain when I describe him, but he is a literal pro-child labor, pro-tobacco advocate with ties to the racist League of the South. So he wrote an article in 2000. Yeah, there he is, top left, right? He wrote an article in 2016 called Let the Kids Work. And so he summoned this group together in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. That's where the name comes from. And if you listen to the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration today, they'll say, we just called for, schools to be allowed to be open and churches to be allowed to be open and small businesses to be allowed to be open. And there's some truth to that, but it was a plan of herd immunity via mass infection. So they claimed that the mass infection of people under age 60 or maybe under age 70, none of whom who were vaccinated at that time, would end the pandemic in 3 to 6 months.
But focus on protecting the vulnerable, right?
Right. So they claim that if you magically, identified people who was vulnerable, and then there's obviously some truth to this, that a, 80-year-old with diabetes and cancer is infinitely more vulnerable than a healthy 10-year-old. Although, some healthy 10-year-olds got very sick and died from COVID. Not many, but definitely not zero. But if you manage to create an impenetrable barrier between those two groups somehow, then you could let the virus, you could have a land of zero COVID and a land of pure COVID. And once everyone got COVID, they claimed that one infection led to decades of immunity, even though when they wrote the declaration, the virus was less than a year old. So who knows how they knew that, which obviously they didn't. But they claimed that it would end the pandemic in 3 to 6 months. And even though they claimed to be silenced and censored, they had already met with President Trump in the Oval Office in August of 2020, even before they signed it. Scott Atlas, who didn't sign it, but he was in contact with them. He was their friend from Stanford. He brought their ideas to the White House when he served as Trump's coronavirus czar. And the day after it was signed, they met with the then head secretary of the HHS, Alex Azar. And it's important that these guys.
That's another good cartoon villain name.
Yeah. These guys didn't do anything. All they did is they called for and they proposed and they argued for. It's as if I proposed that we never let COVID into the country altogether. That's a great proposal, right? We could have had 0 deaths. Everything could have been wide open. We would have had the best of both worlds. But of course, that's not a very good plan. I kind of liken the Great Barrington Declaration to a football coach telling his players, my plan for you is to score more points than the other team. I mean, it's not wrong. It's the perfect plan, but it's not a very good one. And it will fail. And it did fail.
Right. So we talk about some of those characters, we use that term, that influenced 45's administration and has greatly influenced the current administration. Not everyone might be aware. Everybody knows RFK Jr. and he's running HHS. But can you talk a bit about how some of those players translated into roles that are now impacting policy and like the vaccine schedule we just talked about?
Yeah. Well,
Because I
like
mean,
everyone,
Marty McCary, probably a household name for the COVID and long COVID community. I'm not sure too many people know, the roots of those individuals and how they landed in key roles in the current administration.
yeah, like pretty much everyone in the current administration, they landed their roles because they were social media stars. They were famous on Twitter. They were famous on Fox News. Again, they didn't do anything. They didn't help protect the vulnerable in nursing homes. They didn't help open schools. They didn't do anything that they claimed that they would have done. They just went on Fox News and made podcasts the way I'm doing now, just saying, here's what I propose, here's what I argue for. And when I say that we don't have to wonder whether it would have worked, we can just look at what happened in Florida, because they also advised Ron DeSantis and they had a lot of real world influence there. And when they helped run the show in Florida, especially during the Delta wave in the summer of 2021, what happened? Schools closed, vulnerable people died, so-called not vulnerable people died and got sick, and teachers died and got sick. So they didn't do anything that they claimed that they would have done. But based on these accomplishments that were incredible and wonderful, but also totally imaginary, that they would have opened schools and protected the vulnerable, they got these high positions. So Jay Bhattacharya is now running the NIH, where he seems to be kind of an ineffective figurehead, is the best thing I can say about him.
He's also got a background as an economist, which I'm not sure economists would be the first thing I would look at on a CV or resume to fill that seat.
Yeah. He seems to be in kind of over his head. People mock him as Podcast Jay because he spends most of his time going on podcasts. He seems to be loathed and kind of totally disrespected by rank and file NIH people. And important decisions seem to be getting made above his head. It's not really clear what he is doing all the time. A lot of people have quit in protest, or claim that they have been censored and silenced, which again is kind of how he rose to power, saying how silenced and censored he was. And then Martin Kulldorff kind of has this, as best I can tell, this kind of nebulous position at the CDC as a vaccine advisor. And he claimed that putting Kennedy in power would increase confidence in vaccines, because Kennedy would finally do all of the studies that would forever put to doubt any questions about the safety of vaccines. But now that these guys are in power, of course, they are attacking vaccines and they're blaming their predecessors for low vaccine rates. They're saying it was, mistrust during COVID that led to low vaccine rates, that toddlers wore masks. That's all they know how to say. And they're going to be talking about toddlers wearing masks for the next 50 years. Neglecting, of course, that Kennedy is the country's, if not the world's, leading anti-vaccine disinformation agent for the past 20 years, who at the end of 2024 was showing the movie Vaxxed 3, Authorized to Kill. And since he has gotten in power, he said many similar things, that the measles vaccine kills, and that everyone should get measles, and that only very, very sick kids should die from measles. I mean, just these horrific things, and it's not a shock that we've had or at least a 30-year record number of measles cases, and also pertussis, and also flu, and also COVID.
Right. It's not a huge number, but it's a huge impact to the parents of those children that are affected that didn't get vaxxed. You mentioned by state. I did a YouTube video parody of Last Week Tonight, right near the onset, that talked about the politicization of COVID and long COVID. And I looked at the data, and it pretty much showed the rate of infection and rate of death in red states was exponentially higher. You mentioned Florida, and of course, with a very strong governor in Ron DeSantis, words matter. And, he's telling, and I actually had a good friend of my wife's, of ours. She moved to Florida because she couldn't handle the rhetoric in Colorado, and she's anti-vax. And, it is the United States. It's a personal choice, a personal decision. but yet people lean or look towards our elected officials, and they go to the CDC website to look for guidance. So it's absolutely crazy. McCary and Vinay Prasad, I'm not sure if you touched on those two and their role in the FDA and in vaccines as well.
Yeah. So those are another sort of two kind of bad faith actors. I mean, I think probably Marty McCary was the only one who was famous before the pandemic, mostly for his claim that medical error was the third leading cause of death, which is a totally bogus statistic. And actually one that Vinay Prasad blasted back, I think in 2016, when he was a reasonable doctor. And so
he's a child oncologist, right?
I don't know about a child oncologist.
I thought he was focused on oncology in the pediatric arena, but I may have that wrong.
Yeah, no, it doesn't really matter. He's an oncologist who actually had some good ideas before the pandemic. I think about drug approvals and standards of evidence. But during the pandemic, especially after 2021, after 2020, just started spreading rank disinformation. Like all of these guys, he vastly overpromised the vaccine in the first half of 2021 when it was brand new, claiming it would definitely end the pandemic and that it blocked transmission and that we don't need to vaccinate kids because if we vaccinate adults, that will be enough. So they treated both the vaccine and a virus like it was this, old familiar friend, like it was the measles and the measles vaccine, and we knew everything about it. Obviously, it didn't turn out to be the case. He just spread blatantly false statistics claiming that the flu was as dangerous or for children as COVID, for example, which was, especially at the time he said it, was totally false. May not be false today, but when he said it was 5 years ago. And just behaved in a very nasty way, right? I mean, he famously mocked people who suffered from long COVID and, said it was just anxiety and joked about it and really mocked people suffering in ways that I think brought shame on the medical profession. Like, I'm very embarrassed as a doctor that non-doctors have to see my profession behave that way in public. He was vulgar and vile and threatening, and several of his quotes were used by authors writing about the terrorist attack at the CDC. How he doesn't fucking believe in forgiveness for these fucking liars. Sorry if anyone's listening in the car. No. Maybe you can. I'm just quoting Vinay Prasad at this point. But.
Yeah, you've used every word we've already used here on the podcast. They have a lot of takes that don't age well. One from Prasad was letting fucking morons run public health is the greatest anti-vaccine movement imaginable. He's
right about that today, at least.
He nailed that one because look at the cast of characters. Prasad, I've had he blocked me long time ago because he did mock people with long COVID, and that's where I have issue where people whose lives have been devastated by disability, and not everyone gets long COVID. So I acknowledge that there are over 30 million Americans that are afflicted with long COVID like me, and he would joke about it, like getting a subsequent infection and getting, they called it double long COVID. And he joked that it was, Is that like a double IPA? So he made beer jokes about people disabled, which is just a horrible take. Very early on, one of my other parody videos was Vinay the Angry Conspiracy Bear, because he talked about this guy that he saw in the sauna that was wearing a mask. And I'm like, I kind of agree that it probably looked pretty ridiculous, but you're in a very confined space, sharing breathed air. I won't judge the person for that. But then he talked about one day I'll write a book about a little bear who was afraid to leave his house because he might get sick. So I'll share that link to the Vinay the Angry Conspiracy Bear. But just a bunch of clowns.
Yeah, and he made that comment 5 years ago, January 2021. I remember it very well. And that was the deadliest month of the pandemic. 100,000 Americans, or just under 95,000 Americans, died in January 2021.
Which quote?
The bear quote.
Yeah. Oh, Jesus. I didn't realize
so 3,000 Americans were dying every single day when he was making jokes on Twitter about people who are so afraid to leave their house. And now that he and McCary are in charge of the FDA, things are going very poorly. Stat News, especially a reporter by the name of Lizzie Lawrence, has written a lot of articles about how staff just despise him, about how they don't trust him. A very high expert and very well-regarded regulator at the CDC, guy by the name, the FDA, someone who ran their oncology division, Rick Pazdur, just spoke and said how the FDA, where he'd been for 25 years, is kind of a shambles under their care. Vinay Prasad, one of his whole shticks during the pandemic was to say, take some mitigation measure and say, this hasn't been studied in a randomized controlled trial, therefore we shouldn't do it. And he could take, any mitigation measure, including stuff that you cannot study via randomized controlled trials, like hospital visiting policies, for example, and say, they failed us. They let us down. We should have studied this via randomized controlled trial. Meanwhile, now that he's in charge, he hasn't done any of this stuff. And a matter of fact, none of these guys have done any of the things that they said that they would have done, or any of the things that they previously argued for. So as we're talking now in January 2026, flu is spreading, measles and pertussis are spreading. So the shoe is on the other foot. So it's our job, Ty, to call for them to control measles. It's our job for them to argue that they should do randomized controlled trials and protect the vulnerable, and all of the things that they said that they would have done during when COVID raged. And of course, COVID is not gone either. It's their job to do all of those things now, and they're not. They're making podcasts. They're arguing with people on Twitter. Actually, Vinay Prasad, to his credit, has largely disappeared from the public eye. That's the one positive thing I will say about him, as he has finally learned to dial it down. Good for him. I hope he keeps that up the rest of his career, and we never hear from him again. He also made a claim I
think it'll return right when he leaves office. I think it's a temporary, it's a pause on the Substack grift.
Yeah, I also think and hope that a lot of these guys are not going to be welcomed back into academic medicine when their tenure ends, but that, we'll wait and see. Vinay Prasad also released he sent a memo to about 1,000 people at the FDA, knowing that it would be leaked the day after Thanksgiving, claiming that the COVID vaccine killed 10 children. And it's been now 6 weeks, and he's presented zero evidence that this is the case. So these guys are just incompetent leaders out to spread fear and doubt and misinformation.
Yeah, so I'm going to play his game by throwing out a soundbite without his ability to respond.
When one woman dumps you, it's easy to say maybe it was her issue, but when 10 women dump you, you might have to start to look in the mirror.
An absolute clown. So that I think was Vinay Prasad on Sensible Medicine. But anyway, I'll move on. So we've talked. It's impossible. I had this conversation with my wife last night of like, how did medicine become political? And she's like, everything's political. And yeah, I had the Ronald Reagan epiphany that, dating back to the onset of AIDS, it was highly political. And we've been dealing with Trump in his first term pretended it wasn't a thing. Biden pretended it was over. And I don't know what the current administration does in terms of the long COVID community, but there are organizations. I don't want to go too far out on the cork board and yarn chart, but it does appear, and you talk about this in your book, that they're a right wing, we'll call them political organizations that are tied to the Barrington Declaration. I know Prasad has got some, I think, Arnold Ventures money behind him. Can you speak just a bit about, the political nature? It baffles me that, right and wrong and science has become political, but can you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, so all of the doctors who I discussed in my book enmeshed themselves to varying degrees with politicians, ranging from people like Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff, who again met with President Trump in the Oval Office in August 2020, or Scott Atlas, who became his advisor, and they became formal advisors to Ron DeSantis. Marty McCary became Glenn Youngkin's COVID advisor, and they met with, I'm trying to think of all the politicians who they met with. Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, Jim Jordan from Ohio. I mean, just kind of the worst of the worst.
Sure.
Jay Bhattacharya, even though he describes himself as an apolitical public health leader, he was at Ron DeSantis's kind of opening presidential campaign on Twitter, which bombed because it crashed. And then he later spoke at a presidential rally for Kennedy, where he said he was an apolitical leader at a presidential rally. They all openly campaigned for Trump. They all openly campaigned for Kennedy as well. And so I blame them not just for everything that's happening in public health, but for everything that's happening everywhere in this Trump administration. Like, these guys, they own it all. And there was a big support system behind them. Academic medicine, I think we showed more courage rushing in to treat COVID patients 6 years ago, risking our lives, than we did in standing up to bad faith actors on our own. So I think a lot of these universities have a lot to answer for. And same with the media. I know everyone bashes the media, but these guys got press coverage, not just in right-wing disinformation places like Fox News or the Wall Street Journal opinion page, but they were also profiled positively or allowed to write articles for the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the COVID revisionist history book, In COVID's Wake, written by two liberal Princeton political scientists. So there was a giant ecosystem supporting these guys and defending them every step of the way. And then, you hinted at some of the money supporting them. The person who has done the best work for that is Walker Bragman, a journalist who wrote the introduction to Everyone Else Has Lied to You. And I just lifted, with his permission, of course, 20 pages of his articles. But, with, like you said, Jeffrey Tucker at the Brownstone Institute, our Koch money. So there's a lot of these sort of nefarious ties, whereas the people fighting against them are just kind of like you and me, just kind of lone guys with the podcast.
Well, that's what I was, as we were talking, not in my prepared notes, it doesn't appear that there's any peer equivalent in rational thought or organizations. It's all individuals that are trying to do their best, and that's a tough battle, right? Unless there's some, Koch brothers or Arnold Foundation money behind, and I don't know. You can put your conspiracy hat on and figure out oil in Venezuela, and that's very clear. But I don't know what it is. Why there's such a preponderance of right wing money behind just pseudoscience.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the case for years. Nothing that we're seeing now is new. This was all written about in the book Merchants of Doubt, which is about the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry. So everything that we're seeing is old. None of these techniques are new, but there's a huge power imbalance. You're right. On the one hand, we have, people like Peter Hotez and Paul Offit, God bless them, who are doing the Lord's work, but are just kind of doing this independently. There's not much time and money and credit for this in academic medicine. I don't think, not that I do this for a pat on the back and an extra paycheck. But my interest in vaccines has been viewed by my colleagues, as a good thing, right? But kind of as a quirky hobby, like, if I was really
Sure.
if I was really into stamp collecting or something, something like that. And a lot of them were very blind to everything that was happening. I think if you weren't on Twitter, it was probably very good for your mental health, but they missed what was coming. They're totally caught off guard by Kennedy and Bhattacharya and McCary and everything that they're doing to the FDA and the NIH.
Yes, I think you answered my question. The epiphany is the Hotezes of the world, or Topals. They have a strong voice and platform, but the badge they wear is that they aren't tied to that dirty money. It is rooted in science, but it is a bit like a division, a small division football team trying to go up against Alabama, because we are battling that. But anyway, that helped explain some of the yarn on the corkboard, as I call it. So you came out. What really prompted me to, other than I've been following you for a long time, what intrigued me, I had been familiar with the Great Barrington Declaration, but you came out with the Murray Hill Declaration. Is that Murray Hill, New Jersey? First off.
No, this is the neighborhood that I live in New York City. So
okay, because I think there's a Murray Hill, New Jersey.
Probably, yeah.
Thanks for clarifying that. But can you speak to that? I know I asked you online, is there a way to sign it? Because I think there are a lot of people that ultimately signed the Great Barrington Declaration.
Mm-hmm.
But most importantly, can you kind of speak to the Murray Hill Declaration and kind of your retort or rebuttal to the Great Barrington Declaration?
Well, it's kind of half tongue in cheek, right?
Sure.
But it just showed
that's why we get along, is the tongue in cheek stuff.
But it just showed how easy it is to sit at your computer and type out a declaration. And again, this can be found at Science Based Medicine. I think I published this 2 weeks ago. Yes, on January 1st. That's right, New Year's. I chose New Year's because I wanted a memorable date. But again, basically what the Murray Hill Declaration does is it recognizes that things are not going well in terms of public health and infectious diseases. As we said, we're at a 30-year high for measles outbreaks, which has even gotten much worse since I wrote that article. I think South Carolina added like 120 cases over the weekend or something like that. And measles seems to be popping up in basically most states of the union at this point, and is probably the tip of the iceberg. We had 28,000 pertussis cases last year. Flu is filling up hospitals in certain parts of the country. It's closing schools. For a short period of time, but still schools are closing. So basically the Murray Hill Declaration called on our current medical establishment to do everything that they previously proposed and called for. So they called for vulnerable people to be protected. I am now calling for them to protect the vulnerable. They called for.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would argue with, hey, let's protect grandma and grandpa. And both my parents were vaccinated during the crazy part of COVID, and it did extend their lives. That obviously you want to protect the vulnerable regardless of your political affiliation.
Yeah. It called for them to make sure that schools don't have to close due to outbreaks, and to make use of vaccines, masks, ventilation, testing, whatever it takes to make sure that healthy kids are learning in open schools from healthy teachers. It talked about Jay Bhattacharya's newest pandemic plan, his newest one-page pandemic plan, which is essentially that everyone should take care of themselves, that it's your job to render yourself invulnerable to viruses by exercising, not smoking, and eating healthy. And listen, I am pro-exercise. I am pro-eating healthy. I am anti-smoking. But it's his job to make sure that Americans, put down Twinkies, put down their cigarettes, and put on their gym shoes. These guys are the establishment now. They got famous by blasting their predecessors for not totally controlling COVID. And they portrayed themselves as superheroes. Now, you put up the superhero things, but they portrayed themselves as superheroes who would have protected the vulnerable, who would have kept schools open, who would have done all these wonderful things. And the Murray-Hill Declaration calls on them to actually do that now that they have power, now that they are the medical establishment. But what are they doing? They're making podcasts and trying to take away other vaccines. So
we haven't talked. Sorry for the interruption. We haven't talked much about Dr. Oz, who, how he wound up in political office. Well, we know how he wound up in political office. We just talked about that. But I think he like points to supplements, and hey, you're not going to get any arguments out of either one of us to talk about obesity and exercise, and but I'm not sure I believe in the turning upside down of the food chart, but there is a grift still going on, because I think Dr. Oz in a couple of his interviews has pointed to supplements that he probably still sells on his website.
Yeah, Dr. Oz, in some ways I don't talk about him a lot because my standards for him are so much lower. I mean, he's been America's quack for the past 20 years. And he said some pretty horrible things recently about how, the children shouldn't get the flu shot, for example, in the middle of this horrible flu season. I actually think, and this may just be rumor, so if I'm wrong about this, someone please send me a message correcting me. He actually may be doing the best job of them all at running the agency that he is in charge of, CMS, which is in charge of like Medicaid and Medicare. Although he's now, I think, sort of threatening to withhold money from blue states like Minnesota. So maybe he's as horrible as they're all so horrible. It's hard to rank them all. But he fits in perfectly with this administration. And you talked about the grift. I mean, I think we're going to be seeing a lot of untested autism treatments, in quotes, be proposed by this administration. We've already seen that with leucovorin. Dr. Marty McCary went to a trade show last week and basically sounded like an infomercial for AI wellness devices that are going to, track everything, every metric in your body. And this is the sort of thing, by the way, that Vinay Prasad rightfully abhorred before he obtained power, these sort of new gimmicks and devices that are going to tell us so much information. We're going to make everyone healthy with these. But he basically sounds like a salesman at this point. And I think the Surgeon General nominee, who knows what happened to her, but Callie Means or Casey Means, I forget, there's a brother and sister. I forget which one is which. But right. I think Callie is the woman, but owns a stake in some of these wellness companies. And her brother, Casey Means, is a supplement salesman. He runs a company called TrueMed. So there's so much sort of, we who promote vaccines are often called pharma shills and this sort of thing. But every accusation is really a confession with these guys. Right.
But, Jonathan, we are getting gyms in airports, though. So there is a silver lining.
Right. I mean, who's gonna want to, get all sweaty right before you get on a plane, or, sit next to someone who's been working out for an hour?
Of course, I'm a former marathoner and triathlete, and I did have occasions where I had 4 hours in an airport with access to a shower. I thought it was a good idea at the time, but it's okay for your position to change. I mean, they love pulling out sound bites from, especially Dr. Fauci early in the pandemic, of what his first guidance was versus what his second. And I always say, hey, this is something we haven't seen in 100 years. So we were at that time relying on the best people we had and dealing with the guidance as it came. We quickly learned that it was, highly transmittable, which led to, the stay-at-home stuff. I don't think it was nefarious. I think we were doing our best, but we actually performed at the worst. I think we were probably dead last out of, I think in your book, you talk out of 195 countries. We didn't do the best job.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a tragedy which is becoming quickly forgotten. I mean, you see how the 1918 flu pandemic was forgotten, right? There's no memorials to that. It just seemed to be the sort of blip in history. I went to one museum exhibit on it in my life, and I did read a book about it, but for the most part, the 1918 flu pandemic, which the average age of death for that was 27 or 28. So that really, for whatever reason, it killed people in the prime of their life, but it's kind of a blip, a footnote to history at this point. And, COVID tragically may end up being that same thing, even though it was the greatest mass death and mass disabling event in American history.
Right. So I'll probably, migrate towards the end of our conversation with, now that we've completely depressed our audience, these are tough topics, right? And we're living with a kind of a more than questionable set of characters driving, our health guidance. So where would you, if you're a parent or an individual, whoever you may be, where do you go these days for medical guidance that's, centrist, scientific and reasonable?
Yeah. So in the past,
it's not, I don't know, it's a CDC website.
No, correct. I mean, it's interesting how anti-vaxxers and pro-science people have changed place. 5 years ago, they would have said, don't trust the CDC, don't trust the FDA. And now I'm the one, and we're the ones saying, don't trust the CDC and the FDA. So, where do you go? So I think there's a couple of places. First of all, the good news is that 99% of doctors who will actually be there in the hospital if you get sick, still believe in vaccines, still believe in science. We're not perfect, but
sure,
listen to your doctor for the most part. They are out to kind of give you good advice. And it's not like I get some secret pharma shillbucks if someone takes a COVID or flu shot. That's number one. Number two is a lot of states are basically seceding. We're kind of having a public health civil war where large swaths of the country are states. There's this Western Public Health Alliance and this Northeastern Public Health Alliance. So a lot of states still have very good information, as do professional societies, the American Academy of Pediatrics, ACOG, American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And then there's, universities run some very good websites. Paul Offit at the University of Pennsylvania runs, or CHOP, I think it is, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, runs has some very good vaccine information. Something called CIDRAP at the University of Minnesota. They're doing something called the Vaccine Integrity Project, where they are really sort of helping to combat Kennedy and maintain good information about vaccines. So I think those are the places that you can go. Our blog, Science-Based Medicine, we're not in the business of giving healthcare advice, but we're as much of exposing bad faith actors. And there's some other very good blogs. There's a blog called Vaxopedia, which just has a refutation of every single anti-vaccine piece of disinformation you can ever imagine in the world. Dr. Vincentelli has been running that for about 20 years or 15, 20 years. It's got everything. So there's a lot of good resources out there, fortunately, but there's a lot of bad information out there, unfortunately as well.
Yeah, I'll echo that. And for our YouTube listeners, I added a picture I'll close with. But the other piece that I touched on very briefly is the funding of science in this country. And I talked a lot about it in the previous podcast episode or 2 episodes ago with Kiko Awasaki from Yale. The budget hacks that science and research has endured is absolutely brutal. We won't talk about ICE in this episode, but their budget, I believe, is like $55 billion. And they cut the National Cancer Institute budget by 40% this year to, I think, a paltry $4 billion. So it's crazy where we put our investments in. I do agree with where you go. My cancer journey is through CU Anschutz and UC Health in Denver. The oncologist I'm working with happens to be a professor at CU Boulder. And I get great guidance and advice from him versus we open this with, unfortunately, the Dilbert cartoonist who started out by listening to a medical quack in Canada that prescribed, ivermectin. Not to go too far off on a tangent, I too had an old friend that saw I had cancer, and he sent me a link to a Joe Rogan episode with the actor whose name escapes me. I'll put a link recommending ivermectin. So I hadn't heard from this guy in years. He's like, "Oh, you got cancer. You should take
Mel
ivermectin."
Gibson?
Yes, Mel Gibson. So I'm not going to take my medical advice from Mel Gibson and Joe Rogan. I will take my medical advice from a professor at CU Anschutz. But I love. Thank you for this conversation. I love New York City. I'm for our YouTube listeners. The very first time I was at Roosevelt Island, we talked about that at the top, where you looked out from the hospital window in a very bad time. I ran a 5K there, and being a former runner, I still revel in my former life. But it's been a true joy to have you on the podcast here today. Any closing comments before we sign off?
No, just thanks you so much for having me, and I appreciate that you do to try to get all the good information out there. And it's especially important to hear from someone who's been suffering from long COVID, because you have a perspective that I don't, and kind of hope I never will have. Like you said, you wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy, but a lot of the suffering is done behind closed doors, and it's not visible. So thank you very much for bringing that to light, and
We'll get back to bringing light to darkness in our next episode, but it is important to be informed, and advocacy has been a big part. So thank you again, Dr. Howard, and good luck on the next book in your next venture.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. You too. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thanks for joining the Butterfly Pavilion Podcast, and remember, like and subscribe.